So welcome to everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Jim Branham, the Executive Officer of the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, and welcome to our sessions this afternoon that we are calling Save California, the Urgent Need to Restore Our Primary Watershed. And a couple of people reacted to the idea that we said Save California, like, really? I mean, that's a little bit of an overstatement, right? But we thought it was really important to drive home the point of how important this region is to all of California, whether it be water or air or recreation or habitat or products. It's a critically important part of California. So we thought that hopefully made the point. We have a lot of ground to cover this afternoon, and so I'm just going to be very brief here in terms of, again, thanking everybody for being here. The effort which we're going to talk about after the scientists give us a heavy dose of reality here in the first session is really a project, if you will, that we've been working with the United States Forest Service and a lot of you in the audience, a lot of partners on over the last few years of really trying to figure out a way to restore the health of our Sierra Nevada forest and watersheds and the communities within the Sierra Nevada. It's a hard uphill battle, literally and figuratively, and we have come to this point in time with the Forest Service in the idea that we really want to have a more Randy and Barney were cohesive strategy, which is a term the federal government uses to describe working together, a cohesive strategy about addressing watershed health in the Sierra Nevada region. And that we need to be more, we have more of a forum, if you will, and more of kind of a there in terms of what we're trying to do and tying it all together. So it's been our effort in working with many of you to pull this together today is really the launch of what we're calling the Sierra Nevada Watershed Improvement Program. An idea stolen without shame from the Tahoe Basin, where they have an environmental improvement program that has been extremely successful at focusing various parties on a common set of goals and objectives, and also being quite an effective tool for investment into that area, which is what we'd like to see in the Sierra Nevada. So we're excited to be able to provide this information to you. The first session will be a couple of presentations about some of the science of some of these issues around the region, and then after the break we'll have a U-table discussion with a number of state agencies, the Forest Service, and some of the key partners, stakeholders we have been working with on these issues around where do we go from here and how do we address these issues and do this in a integrated fashion that begins to really increase the pace and scale of watershed restoration in our region. With that, I'm going to introduce and turn it over to the Regional Forester for Region 5 of the United States Forest Service. You've been there how long in this position?
Not too long.
Not too long? Long enough. We've been working with Randy Moore since he arrived. I don't know what that meant exactly, Barney, but there was some message there, I think. We've been working with Randy Moore since he's arrived as a regional forester, and have enjoyed the working relationship, and I think really think this is an opportunity to begin to turn the tide on these issues. So Randy?
Great. Thanks, Jim. So that was an internal joke there. When someone asks you how long you've been in place, you say not too long, because then they start looking for you to move if you've been there long. So only Forest Service employees would have gotten that. So good afternoon, and I'm really glad to be here and to be a part of this partnership. And both Jim and I really look forward to all of you all joining us. I think we realize just in a short period of time that the issue of the Sierras and the restoration it's bigger than any one agency, and it's bigger than any one particular person or group of people. And as I've looked at working up and down the state, developing our leadership's intent or leaders' intent on ecological restoration, we involved a lot of people, state, federal, local, nonprofits, you name it. It went into developing that leader's intent, which is kind of guiding us now. But we've also noticed that when trying to implement the ecological restoration piece, is that it's all about increasing the pace and scale of work out on those lands. And we also have realized that no one agency can do it. So when we talk about the green lands, those lands that the Forest Service manages, we have the appropriated dollars. It's nowhere near enough. And when I look at what is happening in this state, there's a sense of urgency that we really need to begin to pay attention to that landscape that's so important for all of our Californians. And, you know, I look at what happened just this past year, where we had just under 500,000 acres that burned under wildfire conditions. And we spent gobs of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, on those 500,000 acres that burned. And when I look at what we're appropriated to do in terms of restoration work or work on the landscape, we were able to do about 50,000 acres of restoration work. So as you can tell, that 150,000 acres of restoration work is not even half of what burned under the wildfire conditions just this last year. And when I look at the 10-year average of what's happening in the state, on the average, we burn about 500,000 acres a year. We repair or restore about 150 to 180,000 acres. And so here again, just echoing Jim's statement, there's a sense of urgency to increase the pace and scale. And this meeting here today is to try and engage all of you all to be a part of this, because what we should be looking at is all lands. We should be looking at landscapes, and we need to be looking at these large pieces of land. And how can we work together to make a difference in what's going on out there? So this is an effort for us to have a conversation around what's going on and this partnership, but it's also about what are you willing to do? What are you willing to do to be a part of this partnership to make a difference on what's happening? So with that, I look forward to this conversation, and I also look forward to the conversations after this conversation. So again, welcome, and look forward to the dialogue.
Thanks, Randy. Okay, thank you, Randy. So today's sessions, we have decided, with looking around this room and knowing some of you like to talk a lot, we needed to facilitate this session to make sure that we stayed on track. And Dorian Fagers with the Center for Collaborative Policy is somebody who's many of us have worked with a lot of forest issues. He's an excellent facilitator, and so he will be keeping us on target and on time. So I'm going to introduce him now, and he will move through the panel discussions. We'll take a break. Our goal tonight is to be out of here today at 4:45. Hopefully all of you are going to the celebration, the 10-year celebration of the Conservancy that is happening a few blocks away, but we will be wrapping up by 4:45, so we got a lot to jam into this. So with that, Dorian.
Thanks, Jim. Good afternoon. Dorian Fugere with the Center for Collaborative Policy. Little piece of information before we get started. So we're part of California State University, Sacramento. We're based here. Our office is downtown. We work statewide with the Conservancy, Forest Service, many state and federal agencies, and local government agencies throughout California. A little bit of information as we get started here. Jim already reviewed the basics of the agenda. Just so you're clear, we'll take our two presenters, Dr. Hugh Safford and Dr. Lee Tarnay, and then we'll go to discussion for about a half an hour. We're going to have that be open. There are a lot of you, so please bear with us. Be patient. We'll hold a queue and try and get through as many questions as we can. We have a break around 2:30. We come back. We have 3 additional speakers. We have Chris Chernell with California Natural Resources Agencies, Barney Gant with Forest Service, and also Bob Kirkwood with Sierra Nevada Conservancy Governing Board. After that, we have about an hour for the panelists up here to have discussion, and then we'll open it back up again to general comments and discussion, probably right around 4. And then around 4:30 or so, like Jim said, we'll start wrapping things up. We'll have some closing comments, and we'll be out of here no later than 4:45. Just a couple of suggestions, some suggested guidelines for discussion. A couple of things. If you have a phone or something that makes noise, if you could turn it to silent or vibrate or off just so it doesn't interrupt us, that would be appreciated. All ideas and points of view do have value. If there's difference of opinion with your colleague or with someone across the room, that's fine. We're really here to hear it and get a range of different ideas. So I encourage you not to be shy, just to also be respectful. Humor is always welcome. It just shouldn't be at someone else's expense. Comfort, please be comfortable. We do have that break right around 2:30. If you need to use the restrooms, they're back out here to the right once you get out the door. And just honor time. Like Jim said, we have a lot of stuff, so we want to make sure we have some good guideposts for the agenda. We'll make sure we get through it. So without further ado, I'll invite Dr. Safford to come up. Did you want to say anything else about you before we get started, Jim, or just turn over? The man that needs no introduction.
That's funny. I'm going So I was wondering where, I'm here in a state office, and where are the recycling bins, you guys? Come on. I've got a stack of plastic and paper going over there already. I'm looking where I live in Davis, right? So I'm just like starting to get like all like this. Where's the recycling, man? Okay, so I don't have a monitor, so I'm going to have to look back because I can't remember what I wrote. All right, so I got 20 minutes to really scare you. That's what they told me. You could, let me see, where's my thing? Is this thing on yet? It is not. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about climate change, fire, and their interactions with a whole lot of other disturbances in the Sierra Nevada. And I'm going to talk about the implications of those interactions for management of terrestrial ecosystems. I'm going to be focusing primarily on biological features, things like plant diversity, wildlife habitat, vegetation. I'll touch on water too. I will not talk explicitly about carbon, soil, or air. I know Lee's going to talk a lot about air and somewhat about carbon. All of those issues are important. I do not have time to cover them all. So I'm going to go through the climate change stuff really fast. I assume you know all of this, all right? So temperatures in California on average have gone up about 1.5 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the last century, and I'll show you some futuring as well here in a few minutes. These are driven largely by nighttime temperatures, not daytime temperatures. So in terms of precipitation, it's kind of interesting, but in the Sierra Nevada and most of northwestern California, precipitation is actually largely up. All right, it's at least steady, and at most stations it's been rising. That's very important, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But what you'll note from that graphic is there's really, really high variability around the mean. And this is one of the features of the California climate. You can almost draw California based on the variability diagram on the left. What that is a diagram of the coefficients of variation, which is essentially a measure of variability across years. There is no such thing as an average precipitation in California, and when people talk about it, it's meaningless. You're either higher than average or lower than average or way higher or way lower than average. All right, that's the way the state works. What's amazing is that the variability in precip is going up over time, even though it's already very variable. This is just an example of the Lake Tahoe station, and the CVs are going up over time. Also, the predictability of precipitation at high elevation in the form of snow is becoming, it's less and less possible. All right, I mean, this year we're at about 19%, I think was what the latest snowpack survey said. But you can see from the Tahoe City station that it's dropped from between 50 and 60% of precipitation in the beginning of the last century to about 30 or 40 now. If you look at it nationally, you can see some interesting patterns. And one of those patterns is that you cannot trust anyone who tries to talk to you about something that occurs across the whole state of California. It's a very variable place. It's like a nation, right? I mean, you can't summarize California politically or economically or socially, and you can't do it ecologically either or climatologically. California holds both the area with the largest loss in climatic water availability in the United States, as well as the only area west of the Rockies that's actually had a slight increase in the amount of climatic water availability over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. Remember that if you stretch California to the East Coast, it goes from Philadelphia to Savannah, Georgia, and you would never talk about Pennsylvania climate and Georgia climate in the same sentence. So I guess I'm saying that we should all secede from each other. And there's the drought map. So that's the thing that my precip diagrams don't pick up. But there you go again. There's the thing I was telling you about, increasing variability. And right now we're at the lowest low in precipitation, probably the science says in about 1,000 years. And it doesn't seem to be getting much better. Okay, so winter snowpack is down across California. That's one of the most important patterns. I know you guys are all familiar with that. It's actually going up in the southern Sierra because when you raise precipitation rates and it continues to come as snow, you get more snowpack. Really important biologically and ecologically and in terms of water availability for the future. Future climate, okay, you know what these say. Temperature is going to go up 5 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit depending on the model over the next 100 years or so. So to put that in context, I live in Davis for most of the year, and the average July high there is about 93. I think in Sac it's about 94. So add 9 degrees to that. What it means is that your average July high in 75 to 100 years is going to be about 103 to 104 between Davis and Sacramento. Can you name a city where that's the average July high right now in the lower 48? Phoenix. So if you stand in Phoenix and you look around, it looks nothing like Central California. So the temperature is not the only thing that will change. This landscape is going to change drastically in the course of the next century. There's the future climate. Basically no snow is going to be falling in the Klamath and in the northern Sierra by the end of this century, probably. Okay, we talked about that. So let's talk a little bit about wildfire. So mean wildfire acreage has been going up across a lot of different kinds of vegetation types, ecosystems in California for a while. But I want to nuance this a little bit because it's important that you understand these sort of nuances. So I'm going to focus mostly on the top left graph and the bottom right graph. So the annual burned area is up, mean fire size is up, maximum fire size is up, actually spectacularly in terms of the last two graphics over the course of the last 3 years, all right? And I actually don't even have last year's data in these diagrams. So in the last few years, we've had between about 150 and 250,000 acres burned in the Sierra Nevada. And when I say Sierra Nevada, I'm talking about our planning Sierra Nevada, so everything from like the Modoc to the Tehachapis and from the Nevada border, right, all the way over to the foothills. So it's a pretty big area. And I just want to remind everyone that before Euro-American settlement in California, we probably burned an average of about 150,000 hectares a year. In other words, we're right on about the amount we probably saw historically before we started putting everything out. The issue is the graph in the bottom right. It's the way those acres that are burning that is the really, really big problem, all right? And so we've been able to document just over the course of the last 30 years a pretty notable rise in the amount of what we call high severity fire. That is fire that is killing trees and killing biomass, releasing carbon into the atmosphere. Now that graphic at the bottom right itself needs to be nuanced because that summarizes across a lot of forest types that are pretty darn different. So if you look at the patterns in low and middle elevation forests versus high elevation forests, it's really different. All right? The pattern is real strong in Jeffrey pine, ponderosa pine, mixed conifer, mixed evergreen, oak woodland, that kind of stuff. All right? There is a very strong increase in the amount of biomass that is being burned by fires over time. You don't see this increase once you get above the line of the deepest snowpack, which is where red fir starts to grow. Okay? Very important to understand. So thus far, we don't see these increases in fire severity in subalpine forests, in red fir forests, or in lodgepole pine forests. However, there's a very worrisome trend that is happening. And that is that recently we've begun to see some larger fires at elevation. We know, actually have a paper in press right now documenting an increase in the maximum elevation of fires over the course of the last 30 years, so they're moving uphill. And also, the proportional increases in area burned are highest at the high elevations. And what's going on? You know what's going on. The snowpack is diminishing. The growing in the fire season is getting longer. There's more growth at high elevation, right? And the freezing line is moving uphill. So this is a harbinger of things to come. And the future trends are that we're all going to burn up. So you already know that. Okay, so let's talk about vegetation a little bit. So we're either going to get burned up or blown away or washed away or dried up and blown away, I guess is what it is. So I'm going to talk about that sort of flatworm-looking polygon in the middle that's called the Sierra Nevada. And this is from some modeling that Jim Lenahan, Ron Nielsen, some other folks from the Forest Service Research Station and from Oregon State University did a few years ago. This is one of the better models out there because it incorporates biogeographic movement, a lot of plant physiology, and it incorporates fire and carbon dynamics as well, all right? Now, what happens in these kinds of modeling exercises is that they throw a whole lot of different future scenarios in the mix, right? Because we really don't know what's going to happen. All right, we know it's going to get warmer, but what happens to precipitation? People have some good hypotheses, but it's hard to put your finger on exactly what's going to happen. So they throw a bunch of models at it, and we do ensemble predictions, right? So it's like, all right, if I throw a dry one and a wet one and a kind of warm and a really warm one, if we find a lot of commonalities among the predictions, then we think, maybe there's some more, we can have a little bit more faith that maybe that sort of the kind of thing is going to happen. So there are 4 things going on in these graphics that I want to draw your attention to. One is they all suggest that there'll be a pretty major increase in the amount of forests dominated by hardwoods. So in other words, oaks, madrone, maple, stuff like that. Okay? Those are the light green bars and the dark orange, brown bars, right? They all suggest that we'll see a loss in the amount of forest dominated by conifers. A couple of them suggest very major losses. They all suggest that there'll be a massive increase in the amount of grassland in the Sierra Nevada. In fact, under the right-hand projection, which projects much drier and much warmer conditions, which most people believe is probably more spot on for where we're going, the range will be dominated by grassland. Does that sound like any other part of the state? It's where Southern California is going, real fast, right? If you look at the foothills of the San Gorgonios or the San Bernardinos or the San Gabriels or the San Annas, they're all turning to grassland as chaparral gets burned so often that woody species can't survive anymore, and it gets filled with annual grasses from the Mediterranean and Central Asia and North Africa, which burn and burn and burn and burn and burn, okay? So those are kind of scary, but then the question is, well, what kind of evidence do we have that this sort of thing might actually happen? Well, actually, if you look at what already has been happening, the scary thing is most of these trends have already been happening for the last 75 years. That modeling exercise was done without any reference to the Forest Service inventory that was done in California in the 1930s. So we worked with UC Berkeley to get those data online. There are 17,000 vegetation plots now available from the 1930s, and we paid UC Davis to digitize all those maps, which are also available now online. And what we did was we took the maps, we crosswalked them to current vegetation types. We changed the scale a little bit so that we could make some comparisons, and here they are. And what you can see first of all is that if you look in the left-hand map at the light green and the light blue, that's the Jeffrey pine and ponderosa pine-dominated forest, you can see that it nearly disappears in the right map. So what happened there is that first of all, we cut almost all of the big examples of those two species down, all right, plus the sugar pine. And then we've been putting fire out for 100 years on this landscape in forests that used to have a fire every 7 to 15 years, all right? I don't know how much you know about the genus Pinus, but pines require a disturbance factor to be a dominant part of the canopy of just about any forest anywhere, unless the soil's really crappy. Okay? So that was why there were so many giant pines in these systems when European Americans showed up in the system, because the fire made it possible for them to be there, because they can't compete without disturbance with white fir, incense cedar, or Douglas fir, which are much more shade tolerant, grow faster, right, and are just better competitors for resources. All right, so that's one pattern that's real clear in this map. Another one is a strong increase in hardwood density. So if you look at the sort of that light purple color in the left map and then in the one in the right map, you'll notice a big expansion. And the data show that. We've done a bunch of resampling of these plots. Real strong increase in montane hardwoods. There is not a strong increase in foothill hardwoods like blue oak and valley oak. They've got their own kind of problems. Third, the map shows some loss of subalpine forests. That might be largely classification error. But at any rate, the point is that those projected changes in that independent modeling exercise for the end of the century, those things are already going on and have been for 75 years. So there are a whole bunch of examples around the state of where you can see ecosystems getting really messed up, and I'm just going to provide you a couple examples. Left one is San Diego, Laguna Mountain after the cedar fire. This was the lowest elevation at which Jeffrey pine grows in Southern California. Since that fire knocked out a lot of that forest, the natural regeneration failed. 2 or 3 tries at replanting it failed, and we finally said, look, stop, you're wasting money. It's too warm and too dry now. That species is gone on that site. So basically we're looking at, there's a change. Okay, it's going to be sagebrush, ceanothus, probably some coulter pine and some oak. I'm not saying that's bad or good, but that's biogeography in action. It's happening, and we're seeing it happen all over the place. On the right side is Topaz Lake, which is the western side of the Great Basin, right? And if you guys know anything about the Great Basin, you'll know that the biggest disaster right now there in Nevada and Utah is the invasion of cheatgrass, okay, and red brome and some other species. And that's what all that brown stuff up there on the hill is. And so pinyon pine is not very well adapted to big stand-replacing fires. Neither is western juniper, okay? And so about every year at this lake, you get a 5,000 to 10,000 acre fire and another whole mountain site of conifers goes up in smoke, and we will never see conifer there again because it's filled now with a continuous mat of cheatgrass, and all it takes is a cigarette and that stuff, and there it goes again, all right? Oh, and then just to kind of complicate the situation is the whole beetle thing. Both of these systems were also majorly affected by beetles, both before and after the fires happened. And although to this point, insect and disease-driven mortality in the Sierra Nevada is nowhere near the levels that we see in the Rocky Mountains, it's rising quickly. Between 2013 and 14, our Forest Health Protection staff measured a 300% increase in forest mortality in the Sierra Nevada, and I guarantee you it's going to be way higher this year. I don't know if you guys have been out on the ground, but man, if you go to the Sierra National Forest, or the Inyo, or the Modoc, or if you want to go beyond the Sierra Nevada to the Cleveland or to the Los Padres, man, it's just, there's dead stuff all over the place. And then a lot of forest lands getting converted to shrubland. Again, that's not necessarily always bad, but it's happening in huge blocks rather than sort of the salt and peppery fashion we would have expected under a fire under the historic conditions. And then the right-hand picture is sort of the whole story of the foothills in Southern California, and this is starting to happen in the Sierra Nevada as well. Good news all around. Okay, and then, so the one thing that I really want to focus on, and I'm going to talk about this again in this next section, is the really, really important role that fire suppression plays in a whole lot of this. It's really important that you understand that a lot of these forest types, fire suppression is at least as important a disturbance as the uncharacteristic severe fire we're seeing. And in fact, remember that fire suppression is one of the main causal factors behind the very severe fires that we're seeing. So you see pictures like the one on the left, you could have taken that anywhere. There are so many examples of old trees left standing in a matrix of a little teeny shade-tolerant, fire-intolerant, drought-intolerant species that have come up in the course of the last century. You could take it anywhere. And then there's a whole lot of meadows being converted to forestland as well. In some cases, it's just simple climate change. Some places, it's due to some fire and some grazing interactions. I don't think I have time for that. Pretty graph, but I won't spend any time on that. I'm going to move on to that. Okay, so in terms of biodiversity implications, am I going fast enough for you, by the way? I haven't breathed yet. Did you know that? Species are going to adapt to fill niches that are created by some sort of characteristic disturbance regime, right? The kind of thing that you have over millennia or even longer. And in the Sierra Nevada, the system that we do the most management in, that dominates most of the range, and that most of the resource management issues happen in, is this yellow pine and mixed conifer forest. And when you have systems like in the top left that are a little bit closer to reference, where we've done some restoration, in this case this was in the Lake Tahoe Basin, and you burn them even under severe conditions, you get 80 to 100% survival. And a very strong remnant native plant population that comes back, or community rather. The bottom left is what that stand in the top left looked like before they started doing treatments in it. And when that burned in the Angora fire, there was about 90 to 100% mortality. And much lower native species diversity after fire, because yellow pine and mixed conifer forest is not chaparral. It's a completely different ecosystem. Chaparral needs this kind of fire to generate diversity. Yellow pine and mixed conifer forest don't. So we have a study right now that's in press that shows across all these fires that we sampled in the Sierra Nevada that the lowest plant species diversity is 1, in areas that have not burned in 100 years, and 2, areas that burned at very high severity recently. Where most of the plant species diversity is in the places we work is where it's burned at low or moderate severity. And we see it also in another place that we've done work, and we have a paper in press on this too, in the Rich Fire and the Plumas, same pattern. Highest plant species diversity in low and moderate burned plots. Okay, whatever. Go to the next one. Okay, I just don't have time to summarize because I'm summarizing as I go. Okay, this is my last set, and then I've got a few concluding statements. Just want to talk briefly about wildlife habitat, and I'm just going to focus on 2 groups of critters. And those are those that are sort of old forest obligates, fish or owl, goshawk kinds of things, and those that are post-fire specialists, and those are probably best represented by a bunch of avian species like woodpeckers. So let's start with the old forest obligates. I did some modeling with some colleagues a few years ago from TNC and University of Washington, and we looked at macroclimatic parameters for Fisher. And what was really clear from our modeling was that by 2100, there isn't any macroclimate that a fisher can survive under anymore in California. That doesn't mean it can't live here, because our modeling didn't incorporate topographic variability, right? So there are places, north-facing slopes, deep canyons, probably where they could hang on if we could give them the kind of habitat they need. But that's important to understand, that it's going to have a rough time in the future in this state. And that modeling we did not at all take into account fire at all. All right, and we know what fire does to old forest habitat under current conditions, right? And in fact, all those projected future increases in fire severity are already happening. Okay, it's not just future, it's going on right now. So the thing to understand is that those species that require old forest habitat on the landscapes we manage are in a lot of trouble. And it's going to take some really serious dialogue about how we get out in front of this program, and of course, this problem, and of course that dialogue has been dominating our lives in the Forest Service for about the last 20 years. But those species that require snag habitat, they're going to have a whole lot of habitat, and they already do. And that dotted line is between 1984 and 2014, 7-year moving average for the amount of snag habitat being created on an annual basis in the Sierra Nevada. And you can see it's going up, 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 and it's going to keep going up and up and up in the future. Okay, I'm going to skip that one, and here are my concluding thoughts. Okay, so basically we are in a situation where we are at and entering threshold conditions for a lot of ecosystem types in California. Both for federal and state agencies, a lot of them are focused on things like restoration, ecosystem services, climate change adaptation, mitigation, and that's where they need to be. I just want to note that with respect to restoration, we shouldn't give up the word. A lot of people think, oh, it's got this sort of connotation of going back to the past and we can't do that. It doesn't have to have that. It needs to be about restoring ecosystem services, ecosystem functions. All right? One of the biggest issues we've got is the fact that we are so focused on a couple of species and we're not thinking about all the other species and all the other functions and all the other processes, and we have to find a way to get some kind of balance. I mean, if we're going to solve this problem in the long run. You know, you think I'd learn, right? If I was going to have concluding thoughts, it'd be like 3 or 4 words per bullet, huh? But when they tell me I got 20 minutes, what am I going to do, right? So I want to talk about insect outbreaks and disease real quickly, and that is that I expect they're going to be a really major problem in the Sierra Nevada in the next 2, 3, 4 years, probably, unless we just get some crazy burst of precip all of a sudden. Haven't seen the kind of problems we've seen in the Rockies, but it's increasing. I think people have got to get used to the fact that the Sierra Nevada is going to look a lot different in 100 years than it does now. I think you just simply have to understand that we can change the outcomes in some of these situations. We know how to do it. There are tools. There needs to be political will, right? There needs to be money. There needs to be some dialogue about how to do it. And we can help soften the landing in some others. But there are going to be some real major changes, and it would be best if these happened in a slow, moderate, and maybe controlled fashion where we can make that happen. Again, I'll just repeat the question about the issue about the old forest obligates. They're in real trouble. The other one here is we have to figure out across all the agencies, public, private, everybody, how we reintroduce fire as a beneficial force in Sierra Nevada forest, because mechanical means are a really important part of the fix. But we all know that they can't solve it in terms of the acreage in the end. So to me, one of the really positive things that's coming out of our current planning effort in the southern Sierra Nevada is that there's some real changes being made to the way that we're going to think about how wild and fire gets managed. It's actually very exciting stuff. I had a big meeting yesterday with some fire people about this. Maybe we can talk about it in the discussion. The other thing I'd like to suggest is it's real important that we start to get experimental about things. And here's what I mean by that. Humans, if you look at the psychology of humans, how do they learn? Most humans learn experientially, number one. So unless they're doing it and it's happening in front of them and they're part of it, you don't learn a lot. Secondly, humans learn much more when unexpected things happen than when expected things happen. So when you add those two things together, what it means is if you're not experimenting and actually doing things and trying new stuff, you don't learn much. That's a difficult thing for an agency to do. Again, that's going to require a whole lot of partnership to make this kind of thing happen. But if we don't start experimenting and trying things and monitoring and learning from them and applying that learning to course adjustments in the future, there's some disasters waiting out there for us. And then finally, I always end on a pessimistic note so that we can get all optimistic. And that is that the thing that worries all of us, I think, is that I think a lot of us understand what the issues are. I think some of us have some ideological or other bases for thinking one way versus thinking another way. And there's going to have to be a whole lot of collaboration on this. But, you know, the problem, really, I studied history originally in college, and the one thing you learn is that big problems don't get solved until they become catastrophes. And I think that's why we're here, because these problems are tractable. They are. But we have to get out in front of these problems, and we have to do it soon. Thanks.